Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name's Becca, and in today's video, we're going to talk about my Monica quilt. In today's video, I want to share with you the story of my Monica quilt. But before we do, I just want to let you know this is a new format for me, and I'm a little bit nervous about whether or not you're going to like it. So if you like this format, the best way to encourage me to do more like this, subscribe, thumbs up, comment down below, share it with your friends. This is what I'm calling a quilt story. It is not an unboxing, it is not a sew along, and it is not a tutorial, though I will have a free PDF for you in the first comment down below this video if you want to print something out to make this project. This is just a video diary where I am sharing with you some of my thoughts and memories of a recent make that came out of my studio. That make is the quilt top for my Monica's quilt. So what is the Monica quilt? Well, glad you asked. Have you ever seen the show Friends? I used to watch Friends back in the 90s, but I wasn't a quilter then. But I am now. And I bring that up because as a quilter, I feel like we see the world a little bit differently once we fall in love with textiles. We see colors differently, and oh my goodness, patterns are just screaming for us to recreate them in quilts. I don't know how many times you'll go through life looking around at things around you and thinking, I could make that, and you file it away as an idea for you to make the next time you're in your sewing room. That's what happened with this quilt. I watched Friends a lot when I was younger, and it is one of those comfort TV shows. When I need to unwind or I just want to have something on in my studio, I'll turn on Friends. And I remember shortly after I started quilting and I fell in love with batik fabrics, I had an episode of Friends on. And I was watching it, and draped over the back of the chair that Joey was sitting in was this really pretty quilt. It was made of red and white fabrics, all cut into the same size squares, and those squares were arranged in a checkerboard fabric. But what caught my eye was not the arrangement of the fabrics, and it really wasn't the color red or the color cream that was in the quilt. It was the movement that I saw in the red and the cream. I swore that I saw just a little bit of texture, just a little bit of movement in those fabrics. And since I had just discovered this wonderful world of batiks, yeah, that's where my mind immediately went. I wonder if they made this with batiks. I bet they did. Ooh, I bet I could make this with batiks. Wow, that looks like it's just a simple 4-patch quilt. Yeah, this is going to be great. That became an obsession, and it was something that I wanted to make, but I never prioritized it. I never gave myself the freedom to go buy those fabrics and make the quilt top. So I tucked the idea away in the back of my brain, and I kind of forgot about it. Every once in a while, it would creep back up and I'd shove it back down and I'd do some other things. I'm going to blame the brothers over at So Yeah Quilting for this one, because in June of 2022, in our So Yeah Basics box, we got some batik fabric. Specifically, some red and some white batik fabrics. If you don't know what the So Yeah Basics box is, this is basically a subscription box that they're curating every single month to go out to you. And the fabric in the box features a different basic line from some of the top fabric manufacturers in the industry. So it goes without saying that one of the boxes was going to feature batiks. The batiks box was June. When I cracked open the June box, I saw an assortment of red batik fat quarters and some white batik yardage. And immediately I thought, ooh, Monica quilt. However, after looking at the fat quarters that were in there, they just didn't read as the right red. It wasn't what I was looking for. They were gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't right for that project. So I set the fabric aside with the intentions to do something else with it at a later time. That also meant that the idea of working on the Monica project got shoved back in the drawer. The lights in the office got turned off, and I walked out the door. In July of 2022, my mom and I went on a lovely road trip. And on our way home, I needed to break up the drive. And what better way to break up a long, monotonous car drive than stopping in at some lovely quilt shops along the way? I mean, what better way to make your road trip than to stop and fondle some fabric? Am I right? About the time I pulled into Kingsport, Tennessee, it was time to get out and stretch my legs. There's a quilt shop just about a mile away from I-81 called Heavenly Stitches. Now, I know about Heavenly Stitches for two reasons. The first reason is I've shopped there before. It's about an hour away from my mom and dad's home in Wise, Virginia, maybe an hour and change. I've been there on days where my dad has had medical appointments at the hospital in Kingsport or nearby Johnson City. I'll make my way over to Heavenly Stitches, do a little bit of fabric shopping, and then head back to the hospital. But reason number two is because Rob Appel has been there recently, and he actually did a store tour on his channel, which I'll link to up here. If you want to go see what that store is all about, I encourage you to check out the video. This store is very nicely sized, it is well organized, and I usually feel inspired when I walk in, but my muse was just not with me that day. But fortunately, I did find her while I was in there. I must have aimlessly walked around that store for a good 10 or 15 minutes, just kind of meh. Every time I saw something, nothing was speaking to me until I got to the boutique aisle. I saw a group of red batiks on the bolt, all kind of clumped together. And as soon as I saw those red batiks, I went, ooh, Monica quilt. I decided since I had a couple other shop stops planned along my way and I wasn't really feeling inspired about much else, I would take the time in Heavenly Stitches to pick out fabric for my Monica quilt. So while I was in the boutique aisle, I pulled up a screen grab of the quilt from friends that I was working with. And after chatting with the very friendly ladies at Heavenly Stitches, I finally selected two Hoffman batiks that I felt would work perfectly. For both of the prints, I went with Hoffman Bali batiks. For the cream, I chose the color Gardenia from the watercolor line. And for the red, I chose the color Cardinals from the hand paints line. They might not be the exact right shade of cream and red that was used in the quilt on the Friends show, but they definitely are inspired by that. And when I see these fabrics, that's what I think is the Friends show. I'm drawn right back to Monica's living room almost immediately. It's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes when you walk into a quilt store, you have no idea what you're going to find. Sometimes you don't pick the project or the fabric. The project or the fabric picks you. I had no idea how much yardage I needed because I wasn't working from a pattern. I just knew that I needed to have enough. And I would rather have more than not enough. So I erred on the side of caution and I got 5 yards of both that red and the white. It was a little bit pricey, but it was worth it in my opinion because I didn't run out of either of those colors. And if I'm being completely honest, I have plenty left over. When I got home, I was eager to cut into the fabric and get sewing, but I was also a little bit nervous. I've worked with batiks a lot and I have never had a problem with any of them bleeding, especially the good quality batiks. I've seen how batiks are made, and those fabrics are treated to so many different processes to set the dye and to wash out excess dye that I was pretty confident I had a quality product on my hand. But there's some red fabric in there, and I don't want my red and cream quilt to be 50 shades of pink. So I needed to test it. I took some scraps off of the red and the white, I sewed them together into some scrap blocks, and I tossed them in the wash. Now, spoiler alert, I did not do anything different to our wash cycle to wash that scrap bit of fabric. We wash everything on cold water and we dry everything on medium heat. And I figured that needed to be good enough for my scrap fabrics because that's how I'm going to wash the quilt when it's all done. After the wash cycle was all done and I pulled my scrap block out, I was so pleased to see that the red did not bleed one single drop. That told me it was okay to get started pressing and cutting my fabric. But before I did that, I had to decide what size I wanted my blocks to be. I knew I wanted my block size to be a little bit bigger than a charm square, but a little bit smaller than a layer cake square. And so I decided to just go right in the middle. I went with a 7.5-inch unfinished block, which meant I could cut width of fabric strips at 7.5 inches wide. I'm not going to give you a tutorial for how I put this together, but the step-by-steps for what I actually did fabric requirements, cutting instructions, all of that will be in a download in the first comment down below this video. But I will let you know that I felt like the most efficient way to put this quilt together would be to make strip sets of one red and one white, and then subcut from those strip sets my pieces, my little 2 patches, and then assemble the 2 patches into 4 patches, and the 4 patches into rows, and then the rows next to each other, and before you know it, you have a quilt top. So that's exactly what I did. I took all 15 of my red and all 15 of my white, and I made 15 red/white strip sets. And from each of those strip sets, I subcut 4 units that were 7.5 inches wide. I made sure that when I pressed everything, I was pressing all of those 2 patches to the red fabric, which would allow me to nest my seams as I put them into 4 patches and then built out my rows. The quilt is arranged in a 10 by 12 layout, which means it will measure 70 inches across by 84 inches tall. Now, I haven't pre-washed my fabric, so I do know that when I wash it for the first time, it's going to shrink a bit. So it won't be quite 70 inches wide and it won't be quite 84 inches long when it's all said and done, but it'll still be plenty big enough to properly cover you while you're sitting on the couch in front of the TV enjoying a bowl of ice cream and watching an episode of Friends. And let's be honest, at those dimensions, this quilt is perfectly sized to do some other all important things like wearing it as a cape, or even dressing up for Halloween. Boo. I am really excited to have this quilt top done, and I can't wait to get it on the long arm. I had originally thought about putting some borders on the quilt, but I'm being completely honest with you, I don't think I want to. I think leaving it in that red-white checkerboard format with no borders is the best way that I can nod to the quilt that inspired this. This isn't the end of the Monica quilt story. This is just part 1. I still have to load the quilt onto the long arm, quilt it, and bind it, and I've got some really neat ideas that I'm thinking about for how I want to quilt this that will make the Monica quilt uniquely mine, but also a throwback reference to that Friends quilt as well. I don't want to give away too much right now because I don't know what I'm going to do. The ideas are just popping off in my head right now. But I want to let you know there's going to be a part 2 to this video series where I walk you through how I quilted it and how I bound it. It's going to take me a little while to get that video made, so make sure that you're subscribed to the channel so when it's uploaded, you'll be notified and you can come see how this quilt looks when it's all put together. That's my quilt story for today, friends. I am really excited to have my Monica quilt all pieced and put together, and I hope my story inspired you to make something that you've been dreaming of. I'll see you guys all in the next video.
Oops, sorry. I guess we have to do mistakes. Her idea. I'm having too much fun with this. I get to throw stuff at you.
Oh my gosh. Oh, jeez.